Sharon the Warp Spinster here. Thank you for joining me on the channel this morning. We have a beautiful sunny morning today, and I'm just really glad to have this time with you. And I should say that I appreciate sometimes when I have to do a video, I'm at 6s and 7s because I don't know what I want to do, and is it going to turn out, and are people going to think it's really stupid? But I appreciate not only that you tolerate my quirks and my foibles, but that it gives me incentive to try new things and learn new things. And I appreciate everything about you watching, so thank you. Today we want to do a little more on the Curvilinear quilt. And it will come as no surprise to those of you who have watched before that I am semi-obsessed with circles. So we're going to be working with circles today. There are a couple of things I want to try. I almost think in my brain they just became one, but we'll see how it goes. What I would like to do is to cut into this circle, splice something in, and then shift it. So there's some gray that moves into the white background and some of the white background that moves into the gray, but also introduce color in from our warm palette. So I have prepared a circle here, and this is how I usually do my circles if I'm not just flat out raw edge appliquing them. And I will put a link below to a video where I show how I do this, but it's basically formed kind of like a yo-yo around an oak tag base. And then I draw it up with needle and thread, press it, and then the edges are turned under. I have a nice circle and I can applicate it either by machine or by hand. I think I'll probably do it by machine today. That's what I need to do to start with, and then we'll talk about what I'm going to do here. And here is my circle. For those who like the details, I applicate it using monopoly thread from Superior Threads in both the top and the bobbin. And the stitch lengths and width I used were both 1.5 because this is, the edges are turned under instead of being raw edge or fusible. I could have a wider stitch length, a longer stitch length, because I'm not trying to control loose threads with it. And the stitch width, I actually could have gone down to 1.0, which is what I often do when I'm using monopoly to stitch. But anyway, so now what I'm looking to do is something along the lines of what I did with these horizontal pieces in the previous two pieces for Curvilinear. And threads everywhere. But in this case, I want to, as I said, shift things over a little bit. Now, you know I like to do things in threes, but I'm not going to have room for 3 on this size circle. If you want to maintain the circle instead of making it an oval, then whatever you add in to this space has to compensate for the seams that you're taking, both in the piece you're adding and here. And that magic measurement is cut at 1 inch. So if you take a 1/4 inch seam, say I do a cut here, if I take a 1/4 inch seam here to add in the slice, 1/4 inch seam here, that means I have to I'll have a 1/2 inch left here to make up. The piece that I'm adding in is a 1/4 inch off, 1/4 inch off. To get the 1/2 inch here, I need 1 inch. So it's 1 inch. So at first I thought I will do one of these and just slide it or slip it. But I also want to do some colorful slices like this. Now I can either do it this way or do a cross piece. I'm probably not going to do this symmetrically, so the horizontal piece may well run down here, up here, perhaps down here if this is the bottom of my block. because I want a little more weight, visual weight, toward the bottom, so that will help to ground it. So it will probably be here, and then I could do vertical pieces going this direction. But the same thing still applies. If I want to maintain this as a circle, I'm going to have something an inch wide, which is wider than I would want to do for a single strip here. But I could combine them to make them cut a 1/2 inch, so that there's a 1/2 inch of whatever I want in there. And so I could also, as part of this, well, I could also add in that trio of strips. Remember, I like to do things in odd numbers. Those trio of strips going horizontally as well as vertically. I could combine the two in the center, though, by making the combination of, say, this piece plus maybe a single strip, maybe 2 strips, because that will be 3. Along the same line. So I could have a wider strip here and then a couple of really narrow strips riding alongside it, but still shifted. So, decisions. First thing I'm going to do is cut, because then I am committed. So, let me grab my rotary and my ruler. I really have a very squared off piece here. And I'm remembering that I'm going to lose some seam allowance here, so I don't want to be right near the edge, but I don't want it in the center. And I don't want it so close to the center that it looks like I meant it to be centered and I missed. It's not that that doesn't happen, but I prefer that it's not true, and I don't want it to look like I flubbed up. I flub up plenty without intentionally doing that. Okay. So now we have this cut, and you can see that if I did a wider strip, then it's going to be kind of a funky oval. It's just not going to look right. So I have to bring that together with something. So let's make some strips, perhaps, and audition what we want to do. That might be the best option for us here. So I'm going to make a strip that is partly this gray, and this is a different gray than I've used before, actually, but I'm trying to get a mixture of grays in here. Then I will do some gray with a colored strip in the center, and then white, so that when I shift it, it looks like, well, it'll be white over here, color, gray, and it'll shift this way. Of course, I could shift it that way, but in my brain, I've seen it this way, so that's how I have to do it. And that piece will shift. For these narrower strips, if I do it in combination with that, then I want it all to have white, I guess, background on the end. So where it's gray here to match with the background, I want those strips to be long enough that they're going to cover and go beyond this gray. So they're going to be long enough. I don't need to add any gray to it. So however I shift them for this gray and white piece up here, could I get more confusing, then it won't matter, because the colored strips, the narrow strips, are going to be wider than this, so it doesn't matter. They're on a white background regardless. So let me cut some strips, and maybe I can illustrate that better than I said it. Here's the first strip set I did, and this was purely by accident. I thought that this strip was about the right length, because when I put it up against the circle, it was about the same width as the circle, so it would be something that was shifted. But I neglected to recall, i.e. I forgot that I'm doing it more toward the bottom of the circle. So this piece is too long for the sort of illusion I want where that has shifted. So I am going to go back and shorten this piece by quite a bit, actually, so that the shift looks more realistic, as if this is a slice being slid over. And then I'll also cut some narrow strips to See how that might look going either horizontally or vertically. All right, that is better for what I want it to look like. Now we need to think about some thin strips either going this way or this way. If I add strips on here, I think I want to do 2 so that I have a total of 3 elements here. But if I go vertically, I think I'll want 3 of those vertical pieces. So that would still be odd. 1 here, 3 there. All right. I know this looks strange here, but I cut this a little extra width so that if I did decide to add on a couple of thin strips, I'd have a little more wiggle room for trimming them straight. So once again, I will say once again that I am this time going to go out and cut some thin strips to give that a try. Here I've added in 2 narrow strips. These are designed to be 1/8 of an inch wide, which is how wide they are on the other pieces. And I like that better. Oops, don't shift the circle, Karen. I like that better. It adds some more movement to it and a little more interest. Again, I don't want these to be symmetrically placed. I don't want them centered on the block. And I don't want them to be the same length. That just adds some more interest to it. All right, that is where, let me see if I maybe want to shift this a little more. No, I don't want these to be the same to meet up on the edge, so. Definitely like it better with those horizontal strips there, which may make the decision for me about vertical strips. But while we're here, let's do that. It's going to be hard to visualize because, here, let me press this in half and then that'll give us a better idea. I don't hate this either. There would be another strip in there, probably an orange. I have to make sure that I'm not cutting through this. I like them both. Let me know which you like better. I probably will do both now. Not today, but I think there's some real possibilities for, and oh, maybe I do want this one. There's another thing. Do I want this one to anchor? Sorry about the wobble. At the bottom, or do I want it to not bisect that? I kind of think I do. Sorry, Sheila, you're probably saying, no, don't cut it in half. But I think I do want an anchor there. I like them both. But for today, I'm just going to do these pieces. So however I had them arranged, or I'll arrange them again. So I will sew these strips together here. Forget how I had them. I think this one, I got another one that isn't pressed, so I can worry about that later. And this piece. All right, I'm going to go do that. This piece, as I said, I cut extra wide, and I'll have plenty because I'm going to be adding these on. And remember that the sum total of these 3 needs to be 1 inch wide. So everything's going to be narrower. And I need to sew some white strips on the end of these first, and then sew those together, and we'll see where we're at. Having sewed this seam, I trimmed it to about 1/8 of an inch because I want to have enough room for the seam that comes next to this to lay flat, and so that I won't catch. If I'd had a 1/4 inch seam here, the next seam that I do could catch the edge of that seam because this strip is so narrow, and it's going to end up being, I guess, probably a little, well, I cut it so that it would be a little more than 1/8 of an inch. And then when I'm finished with this, I'm going to trim it so that it will be 1/8 of an inch. Not that it's that critical that I do that. And with that narrow a seam, of course, pressing the seam open, which is what I've decided to do here so that I don't get bleed through on the color, I'm using this handy dandy, I don't even know what they call it. It's from Woolly Felted Wonders, and quilt shops are starting to have this, so you can check with them. My quilt shop, well, I didn't have a local quilt shop at the time I bought this. I did order it from Woolly Felted Wonders itself, but check with your quilt shop. They can probably order it for you. And it just makes pressing open seams much easier because you've got this curve you can go over. It's making this much easier than it would have been trying to do it flat. And, sorry, leaning against the camera stand table. So I will finish pressing this and trimming them to the correct width. Pretty narrow on that part of the seam. It's still enough, so it's like 1/8 of an inch, so it's still enough to hold the seam. This is probably going to be a wall quilt rather than used by a toddler. So I can get by with a little narrower seam. All right, so I'm going to trim those up. And just a reminder, when you are doing a seam on such narrow strips, you need to be really careful about having a straight, consistent 1/4 inch seam. It's because the strips are narrower, the least little wobble or wander is going to show up more, because that wobble is going to represent a greater percentage of the width of your strip. You know, if you're doing a 6-inch strip, you still want to do an accurate 1/4 inch, but if you wobble a little bit, it's less noticeable than with a narrow strip. So I'm going to size those up properly, and then I will add this strip on. Actually, I think I'll add this strip first where I want it, and then I will add these onto that, because this is the really critical one for the visual that I want. So I will make sure I do that one first and then add this in, and I'll be back. I mean, really, aren't these thin strips just adorable? I even like them at this 3/8 of an inch width. Hold the presses again. I realized after I sewed this seam that I actually want to sew these pieces together first, because in order to make up for what I'm taking out of this circle and seams, I need that 1-inch cut, so 1 inch wide. So these two, I want to have their 1/8 inch width. I can't take anything off of them because there's nothing, very little to take off of that. So I will take whatever I need to off of this, which of course will only be possible if I don't have this seam sewed. So seam ripper comes out, a little bit of ribbit work. Hoping you can see this close up in spite of all the raveling going on here. But since I had to do a 1/4 inch seam to sew these two pieces together, because I trimmed this seam to 1/8 of an inch, when I sewed that 1/4 inch seam, then I didn't catch that seam as I was sewing. And in fact, I didn't even have to worry about catching it, because I really wanted to make sure that I was sewing an accurate seam. So I wanted to be looking over here, not there. So now I don't have to trim this seam. It's a 1/4 inch, but it's going to lie flat. I'm going to press this open because I think it just makes straighter, at least when I press. It makes these thin strips seem straighter. And it's just going to fold right over that trimmed seam and make it nice and neat on the other side. And now I don't have to, that's the only seam that I had to trim. This one that I sew on here is going to be the same as here. It's just going to fold over the trimmed seam. And in fact, over the other 1/4 inch seam, I hope. Because that's going to fold over this way. So, just an update on that. So far it's looking good. I hope it stays that way. All right, that's all pressed, at least as well as I can get it at the moment with those narrow seams. And I've got a little bit of wobbliness on the edge here, so this is my chance to trim that up, and I'm going to end up with a pretty narrow piece of this too, but I'm all right with that because I'm going to love those narrow strips in with it. So I'm just measuring 1 inch from that edge. And we'll see how it looks. Now it isn't going to, I guess, match with the other pieces where this particular type of element is wider, but it's still, make sure I get this straight, it still is going to have that effect that I want. So, more narrow strips, here we come. And you can see on the back then that everything just folds together very nicely. And those are very narrow strips in there, but it all comes together fine. All right, here is our finished spliced circle, and purely by accident, this piece met up with the edge of this circle, and it throws off this continuation of the circle. So I'm actually going to take out this seam and shift it probably this way a little bit. I want it to completely bisect the circle, so I don't want to shift it that way. So I'm going to shift it this way. It's going to make my block a little smaller, but this was not a planned size anyway. It was just a chunk of fabric I had. So I'm going to take out this seam and shift it. When I pinned it, I thought it was perfect, but it needs to shift a little bit this way. Of course, I could just intentionally have it be shifted over, so top to bottom shift one way or the other, which would be perfectly acceptable. It's just not what I'm trying to do. And this is what I mean by if you center something, then you need to make sure it's centered. If you want it to be offset, then really offset it enough so it doesn't look like this, where I wanted to line up the circle but I didn't. So I am going to take this seam out again for as long as this poor seam can last. I'm going to take it out and shift it just a little bit. All right, finally, this side seems almost, and now I've started to look for it not being exactly perfect. I think it's all right. Now, it may be that no one else would have noticed, much less cared, that that one was off by the various little bit, but I would have always noticed that and it would have bothered me. So I decided I needed to fix it. You may have had a different reaction to it. I think a little pressing there might be in order. Get that evened out. Now, I planned this as a horizontal piece, but of course it could also be a vertical piece, and honestly I may like that better. Except I think I want it on the right. I don't know. Ordinarily, I like to have the bulk of it to the left, the bulk of the design. If I'm doing an asymmetrical quilt, then I like it to mostly be on the left, like a third of white space over here and 2/3 over here. But for some reason, I like it that way. Tomorrow I may like it a different way. Now, there are a couple other options for what we could have done. We could have done a set of these strips. I could have made this however wide I wanted, did whatever I want with that, and then do a reverse applique where I put a piece of fabric with the circle cut out and turned under and just laid it over on top till I got the effect that I wanted. Then I wouldn't have to worry about matching up the circles. Or I could have done the whole thing by applique, just appliqued these strips on as well. That would work. But I wanted to tackle it as a pieced piece. Now, I want to see what would happen if we bisected it now with a narrow strip. I have to go find that narrow strip. Now, I'm not much for symmetry as a general rule, so I don't think I like it there. It looks like a radar screen. Nothing wrong with the radar screen, just not what I'm looking for. And I do like it better offset. I could ground it or raise it up. I like it better this way, but I don't know that I want to add it. This is a very narrow strip, a single strip, so I would probably end up stitching it or maybe couching this because piecing that and trying to get it through all of that would just be a nightmare. So enough with that. That will be it for today, but for a special announcement, those of you who follow me on Instagram or Facebook already know this, but Alice is finished. I repeat, Alice is finished, at least in terms of piecing. So here she is, our debutante Alice. She wants to thank you for your advocacy in keeping me on track and getting this quilt finished. I honestly did not, when I was making those pieces, honestly sort of thought about putting them into a quilt, and that's why I did them in pink and red and white and black, but you kept on advocating for Alice, and she appreciates it, so she thanks you, and I thank you for keeping me on track. You know that I don't make these pieces necessarily to make quilts. I just am exploring things, so Alice appreciates it. She hasn't been trimmed yet. I think I will. I'm quite sure that I want the top and the sides to be squared up, so to speak, so they'll be 90 degrees to each other and they'll be straight. So straight and even on the top and the sides. I thought I wanted to do that at the bottom as well, but now I'm not sure. I think I may want to do a curve at the bottom and just do a bias binding at the bottom. So I'm going to trim up the top and the sides and have her ready to quilt at some point. And then I will decide what to do with the bottom. I would rather have too much at the bottom because I think that is going to be too much of the black and white. I think I'll want to trim that down, but I would rather have too much and have to trim it down after I've done the quilting than the other way around. So that is Alice as she stands now, and she thanks you. That's it for this week. I don't know what I'll do next week, but in the meantime, I hope I will see you then. And in the meantime, be well, be safe, be happy, be quilting. Peace out.